The Hollowbrook Asylum stood as a decaying monolith at the edge of town, shrouded in fog and whispers of its macabre history. Built in the late 1800s, it was once a sanctuary for the mentally ill, praised for its progressive treatment methods. Over time, however, the methods grew darker, and the screams of the patients became a nightly hymn that echoed through the cold stone corridors. When a fire gutted the main wing 50 years ago, killing most of the residents and staff, the asylum was abandoned, left to rot. No one dared approach it, save for urban explorers and thrill-seekers who always left with pale faces and trembling voices, or never left at all. I first heard of Hollowbrook from my college friends. Over late-night beers and dares, we decided to explore the hospital as part of an initiation challenge. The plan was simple: spend a single night inside, capture some footage, and come back as heroes of campus lore. The night we picked was cold, the air heavy with moisture and an inexplicable sense of dread. As we stepped through the rusted gates, a sudden gust of wind blew, carrying with it the faint sound of crying. Inside, the hospital felt alive in its silence. The walls bore peeling paint, revealing sinister graffiti scrawled in what looked like dried blood. Old gurneys and wheelchairs lay scattered, their wheels squeaking faintly when no one touched them. Shadows danced where there was no light. And the air smelled of mildew mixed with a metallic tang that made me uneasy. My friends laughed nervously, trying to hide their discomfort. The calm of the beginning was deceptive. Hours passed as we wandered through the halls, snapping pictures and recording videos. In one of the rooms, we found a logbook filled with scribbled notes from the hospital staff. Most of it was mundane, lists of medications and treatment regimens. But the final entry stood out: they are listening. The patients are speaking to them, and they are coming to stay after midnight. We laughed it off as a prank, though I noticed the others were growing quiet. As the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and the oppressive silence was broken by a faint scratching noise, coming from a door marked restricted. We shouldn't have opened it, but curiosity always wins. Inside, we found an operating room, untouched by time. Blood-stained surgical tools lay on the table, and the walls were adorned with photographs of patients, each one with their eyes scratched out. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a low, guttural moan echoed through the room. My friends bolted, but I froze, unable to move. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and ripple, forming grotesque shapes. A figure stepped out from the darkness, its face pale and eyeless, with an unsettling grin that stretched too wide. It whispered my name, its voice layered with the cries of countless others. I ran, chasing after my friends, but the halls seemed endless. Every door led back to the same room, the operating theater. My friends were gone, their screams fading into the distance. Alone, I heard them calling my name, their voices distorted and desperate. The hospital played tricks on me. I saw my reflection in shattered mirrors, but it wasn't me staring back, it was a version of myself, bloodied and screaming. The walls seemed to pulse like living flesh, and the whispers grew louder, accusing me of crimes I didn't remember committing. By dawn, the hospital spat me out. I stumbled into the morning light, my clothes torn and my sanity in tatters. My friends were never found, and the footage on my camera was corrupted, save for one frame, a group photo of us in the operating room, with shadowy figures looming behind us. Hollowbrook Asylum remains, waiting for its next visitors. It doesn't just trap you within its walls, it leaves you haunted forever. The Hollowbrook Asylum lingered in my mind like a splinter beneath the skin, festering with each passing day. I couldn't shake the memories, or the things I'd seen. My nights were plagued by fevered dreams, drenched in sweat, with the sounds of faint whispers in my ears. My reflection in the mirror often flickered, the face staring back at me hollow-eyed and pale, its mouth curling into an unnatural grin that didn't belong to me. The police asked questions, of course. They wanted to know what happened to my friends. I told them the truth, at least, as much of it as I could without sounding insane. We got separated, I said, my voice trembling. I ran, but I don't know where they went. Detective Harris didn't buy it. His cold, gray eyes bore into mine as he leaned across the table. You expect me to believe you walked out of there, leaving your friends behind, with no explanation? His tone was sharp, accusatory. I didn't leave them, I whispered, clutching the edge of the chair. The asylum, it wouldn't let me find them, right? He muttered, jotting something in his notebook. Ghost stories. Convenient, they searched the asylum, of course, but they didn't find anything. No bodies. No evidence of my friends. Just a few crumbling walls and the stale stench of decay. The official report labeled them as missing, presumed dead. Unofficially, people began to avoid me. Whispers followed me through campus. He's cursed. He knows what really happened. He left them to die. Weeks passed, and the asylum seemed to haunt me even outside its walls. Strange things started happening in my apartment. Doors creaked open on their own. Objects moved from where I'd left them. At night, I'd wake to the sound of faint laughter, high-pitched, childlike, and close. One night, I found muddy footprints trailing from my door to my bed, but the worst part was the dreams. They weren't just nightmares, they felt real. I'd wake up back inside the asylum, wandering its endless, chased by the eyeless figure. Its voice was always in my ear, whispering, taunting. You left them behind. You belong to us now. I stopped sleeping. My eyes were bloodshot, my skin pale and gaunt. My grades slipped, and my professor started to pull me aside, asking if I needed help. But how could I explain what was happening to me? How could I tell them the truth when I didn't even understand it myself? One night, I decided to go back. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. The whispers wouldn't stop. The laughter grew louder. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, my friends, standing in the operating room, their faces twisted in silent screams. They were calling to me. Begging me to come back. The asylum loomed larger in the moonlight, its broken windows staring like blackened eyes. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, and the air inside was colder than I remembered. My flashlight flickered as I stepped through the doors, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The halls felt alive, pulsating with a faint, rhythmic thrum. Shadows twisted and stretched along the walls, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to follow me. The whispers were louder now, echoing from every direction. I called out. Ryan? Lisa? Kate? Are you here? My voice trembled, barely louder than a whisper. A faint giggle answered me. You came back. It was Lisa's voice. But it wasn't right, there was a strange, mocking edge to it. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing against the cracked tiles. As I turned a corner, I saw her, or what was left of her. Lisa stood in the middle of the hallway, her back to me. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with blood. Lisa, I breathed, stepping closer. She turned, and I froze. Her eyes were gone, replaced by gaping, bloody sockets. Her mouth stretched impossibly wide, her lips curling into that same unnatural grin. You left us, she hissed, her voice layered with something dark and otherworldly. I stumbled back, tripping over debris. I tried to find you, I stammered. I didn't mean to leave you, you didn't try hard enough, she said, taking a step toward me. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The halls twisted and changed around me, leading me in circles. Every door I opened led to the same room, the operating theater. The blood-stained tools gleamed under the dim light, and the photographs on the walls seemed to watch me. Then I heard them, Ryan and Kate. Their voices echoed from the shadows, calling my name. Help us. They pleaded. Don't leave us again. I spun around, trying to find them. But the shadows shifted, forming into figures. They weren't my friends, they were the patients. Dozens of them, their eyeless faces staring, their mouths whispering in unison. You shouldn't have come back. The figure from my dreams emerged from the darkness, its grin impossibly wide. "You belong to us now," it said, its voice echoing through my skull. I screamed, my flashlight falling from my hand as the shadows closed in. Cold hands grabbed me, pulling me into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the operating table, its surface gleaming with fresh blood. When I woke up, I was back outside the asylum, my clothes soaked in blood that wasn't mine. My friends were never found. And neither was I, at least, not the person I used to be. Now, I hear the whispers everywhere. They follow me, growing louder with each passing day. The asylum took something from me that night, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes to claim the days after my second visit to Hollowbrook Asylum were paranoia and exhaustion. I didn't feel alone anymore, not even in my own apartment. The shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, and my reflection in the mirror felt like it was waiting for something. My body was present, but my mind was trapped in that godforsaken place, running endlessly through the dark halls. One night, as I sat in my dimly lit living room, the whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder. They were familiar now, distorted voices that seemed to bleed together. "You belong to us, shut up," I shouted, throwing the empty bottle of whiskey I'd been clutching. It shattered against the wall. But the voices only laughed, a chorus of overlapping giggles and moans. The lights flickered. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. And then I saw her. Lisa. She stood in the corner, her eyeless face illuminated by the flickering bulb, her grin wide and glistening. "You can't run forever," she whispered, her head tilting unnaturally to one side. I scrambled back, falling out of my chair. "What do you want from me?" "You left us." Her voice was joined by others, Ryan, Kate, and dozens more. The room filled with their cries, accusing me, blaming me. "You let us die." "No. I tried to save you," I shouted, clutching at my head. The laughter swelled, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room was silent. My chest heaved as I stared at the now empty corner. She was gone. That's when I noticed the blood. It was pooling, under my door, seeping in from the hallway. The smell hit me, a sickly sweet metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I stumbled to the door and flung it open. The hallway was bathed in a dim red light, and the walls were streaked with bloody handprints. At the far end stood a figure, tall and skeletal, its head tilted to one side as it watched me. Its grin was the same one I'd seen in my nightmares, too wide, too... I slammed the door and backed away, my heart pounding. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was an unknown number. My hands trembled as I picked it up and answered, "Hello." A deep, raspy voice spoke. "Come back. Finish what you started." The call disconnected. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I stared at the phone. The screen was cracked, but in the reflection, I saw my friends standing behind me, their faces mutilated and bloodied. "Run," Kate whispered. "It's coming." The door burst open with a deafening crash. The skeletal figure loomed in the doorway, its grin splitting its face almost in half. I didn't think, I just ran. The hallways of my apartment building twisted around me. Impossibly long and narrow. Doors slammed shut as I passed them, and the whispers followed me, growing louder and more chaotic. "You belong here. Stay with us." I found myself outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. But the asylum was there, waiting for me, even though it should have been miles away. Its looming silhouette rose against the black sky, its broken windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. You can't escape," a voice hissed in my ear. I turned, but there was no one there. The asylum's gates creaked open, inviting me in. My feet moved on their own, drawn toward the darkness. Inside, the air was colder than before. And the whispers were deafening. The halls twisted and stretched, their walls pulsating like living flesh. Blood dripped from the ceiling, pooling around my feet. "Ryan. Lisa. Kate." I called out, my voice trembling. they appeared, stepping out of the shadows. But they weren't human anymore. Their skin was pale and mottled, their eyes hollow sockets, and their mouths curled into grotesque grins. "You left us," Ryan said, his voice a guttural rasp. "I didn't mean to." I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't. You could have stayed," Kate whispered, her head lolling to one side. "But you ran. You let it take us." "I'm sorry," I sobbed. "I'm so sorry." "Not good enough," Lisa said, her voice layered with malice. The shadows around them moved, coalescing into the skeletal figure. It reached out a long, bony hand, its fingers curling around my throat. The room spun as its voice echoed in my head. "You belong to us now." Pain erupted in my chest, sharp and all-consuming. I looked down to see the figure's other hand buried in my torso, its fingers wrapped around my heart. The last thing I heard was the sound of my own scream, blending with the laughter of the asylum's many residents, when they found me days later. I was back in my apartment, sitting in the corner with a wide, unnatural grin stretched across my face. The walls were covered in bloody handprints, and my reflection in the mirror was still screaming, "Hollowbrook Asylum doesn't let go." Not really. It just waits, drawing you back in, one nightmare at a time. They say trauma burrows deep, etching scars into the mind long after the body has healed. But what Hollowbrook Asylum left in me was no mere scar. It was a festering wound, growing darker, hungrier, with each passing day. After the night I found myself in my blood-soaked apartment with a grin that wasn't mine, I knew I couldn't escape it. It wasn't finished with me, the whispers followed me everywhere now. Even in crowded places, they slithered into my ears, low and guttural. "Come back," they urged, their tone an insidious mix of demand and delight. My every reflection mocked me, the grin stretching wider, the eyes more sunken, as though my soul were retreating deeper into that cursed asylum. One night, the whispers grew too loud to ignore. My hands moved on their own, gripping a blade from the kitchen. The cold steel pressed against my palm, its weight a chilling promise. "Bring us another," the voices chanted in unison. My reflection gleaming in its hand, urging me forward, I fought back, throwing the knife across the room. The blade clattered to the floor, but the whispers erupted into laughter, mocking, shrill, and inhuman. They weren't asking anymore. They were commanding. My body shuddered as an unbearable pain ripped through my chest, searing and sharp. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. My shirt clung to my skin, soaked in crimson. But there was no wound. Only the sensation of something clawing its way inside. "You can't resist," the skeletal figure from my nightmares hissed, its eyeless face appearing in every shadow. "You belong to us." I woke up on the floor, my body trembling and cold. The knife was gone, replaced by a single photograph placed neatly before me. It was of Ryan, Lisa, and Kate, their faces contorted in agony. Their eyes were gone, their mouths sewn shut with jagged wire. Scrawled across the bottom in dripping red letters were the words, "You know where to find them, the asylum." It was almost welcoming this time, its doors swinging open as I approached. The air inside was thick with the stench of rotting flesh. The walls glistened as though coated with sweat, and the floor squelched beneath my feet. The whispers guided me deeper, their tones shifting between seductive and menacing. "Find them," they purred. "Free them." I reached the operating theater again. The room glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The table at the center gleamed, its surface slick with fresh blood. Tools hung from the walls, rusted scalpels, bone saws, instruments of torment I couldn't name, and there they were, Ryan, Lisa, and Kate hung from chains along the far wall, their bodies contorted in impossible angles. Their skin was flayed in places, exposing raw muscle and bone. Their eyes, or where their eyes had once been, stared blankly ahead, and their mouths opened and closed silently, as though screaming in a world where sound didn't exist. "Help us," Kate finally rasped, her voice barely more than a croak. Before I could move, the skeletal figure emerged from the shadows. Its grin stretched wider than ever, its jagged teeth glistening with something wet and dark. "You came back," it said, its voice echoing through the room. "Good. What do you want from me?" I demanded, though my voice shook. "To play," it replied simply, gesturing to the tools on the wall. "Choose one." I stared at the instruments, my stomach churning. "No. I won't." The figure moved impossibly fast, its long fingers wrapping around my throat. Its grip was cold, its touch burning like acid. "You will," it hissed. "Or they will suffer more." It released me. And I fell to the floor, gasping. I looked back at my friends. Their lips moved silently, their faces pleading. My hand trembled as I reached for a scalpel. The figure laughed, its hollow voice filling the room. "Good choice. What do I have to do?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Set them free," it said, stepping aside. I approached Ryan first. His body sagged in the chains, his head hanging low. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know how to help you." His lips parted, his voice barely audible. "Kill me." I froze. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "End it." The scalpel felt impossibly heavy in my hand. "I can't do it," he screamed. His voice filled with a desperation that shattered my resolve. I plunged the blade into his chest, tears blinding me. His body convulsed, and a horrific scream tore through the room, not from Ryan, but from the walls themselves. When I pulled the blade free, Ryan's body crumbled to ash, his chains falling empty to the floor. The figure clapped slowly, its grin impossibly wide. One down. Two to go. Lisa was next. She didn't beg. She didn't speak. Her hollow sockets stared at me, her lips curled into a faint smile as though I didn't hesitate this time. The scalpel slid into her throat, and her body dissolved into ash. The whispers grew louder, the walls pulsating with a sickly light. When I turned to Kate, she was crying. "Please," she whispered. "Don't let it take me." "I'll get you out," I promised. She shook her head. "There's no way out. Just do it." The scalpel slipped from my hand. "No. There has to be another way." The figure loomed over me, its grin gone. Its voice was sharp, cruel. "You don't have a choice." I screamed, grabbing the blade and turning it on the figure. The scalpel plunged into its chest, but it laughed, a deep, guttural sound that shook the room. "You can't kill me," it said. "You are me." The realization hit like a freight train. The asylum wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was me. Every shadow, every scream, every ounce of torment, it was all born from the darkness within me. As I turned back to Kate, her face twisted into a cruel smile. "You were always going to end up here," she said, her voice no longer her own. The walls closed in, the whispers crescendoing into a deafening roar. The last thing I saw was the operating table, gleaming and ready. My body was strapped to it now, and the figure stood over me, scalpel in hand. "Welcome home," it said, as the blade descended. The darkness wasn't just around me, it was inside me, consuming every shred of who I had once been. When the scalpel plunged into my chest, I didn't feel pain. I felt liberation, as if I had been shackled my entire life and the cold steel was setting me free. My screams were swallowed by the void, my mind unraveling as the skeletal figure loomed closer, its eyeless gaze burning into my soul, but I wasn't dead. I awoke in the same operating room, the scent of blood thick in the air. My hands were slick with crimson, trembling as I realized they held the scalpel. Before me lay a body, mangled, unrecognizable. The face had been peeled, the chest cavity split open like a grotesque flower. My breath hitched as I dropped the blade, stumbling back, my stomach lurching. "What have you done?" A voice whispered. I spun around, but the room was empty. The skeletal figure was gone, but the walls pulsated with a sinister life, oozing black ichor. Shadows danced in the corners, their forms shifting and writhing. I tried to run, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the room, and the chains that once held my friends now dangled above me, their metal links glistening with fresh blood. "You can't leave," the voice hissed, resonating from everywhere and nowhere. Suddenly, the body on the table twitched. I froze, terror rooting me to the spot. The mangled remains began to convulse, its exposed ribs snapping back into place with sickening cracks. The muscles writhed as though alive, stitching themselves together in a horrific mockery of life. "You did this," it rasped, its voice wet and gurgling. "No." I screamed, backing into the wall. I didn't mean to." The creature sat up, its hollow eye sockets fixing on me. The stitched remnants of its lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "We're all part of the game now." I didn't have time to process its words before the chains above me came alive, snaking down with horrifying speed. They coiled around my wrists and ankles, dragging me towards the operating table. I thrashed and screamed, but the chains tightened, biting into my skin and drawing blood. The table was ice cold against my back as the chains pinned me down. The creature loomed over me, its grin widening impossibly as it picked up the scalpel. "Your turn," it said, driving the blade into my arm. The pain was blinding, searing through every nerve as it carved into me with meticulous precision. I screamed until my throat was raw, but the creature didn't stop. It peeled back the flesh, revealing glistening muscle as it worked. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Stop." The creature paused, tilting its head. "Stop. But you're enjoying this, aren't you?" "No." I cried, but deep down, a part of me knew it wasn't entirely true. The pain was unbearable, but beneath it was something else, a dark, insidious pleasure that I couldn't explain. The creature seemed to sense it, its laughter filling the room. "You see. This is what you are. This is what you've always been." It plunged the scalpel into my chest, twisting it as my vision blurred. The darkness crept in again, but this time, it felt like an embrace, a cruel, suffocating embrace that promised no escape. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer strapped to the table. I stood in the center of the operating room, the chains hanging limply above me. The creature was gone, but the whispers were louder than ever, filling the room with their maddening chorus. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in blood, but this time, I wasn't horrified. I felt powerful. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man I didn't recognize, his face pale and terrified. He stumbled backward when he saw me, his eyes darting to the blood-stained tools on the wall. "Please," he stammered, "I don't belong here." The whispers urged me forward, their voices weaving together into a single command. "Take him." I reached for the scalpel, my movements slow and deliberate. The man's screams echoed through the asylum as I advanced, the whispers cheering me on. The scalpel felt light in my hand, almost like an extension of myself. I brought it down, the blade slicing through flesh with ease. Blood sprayed across the room, painting the walls in macabre patterns. The man's cries grew weaker, his body twitching as I worked. The whispers grew louder, their tone one of exhilaration. When it was over, I stood over the mangled remains, my chest heaving. The whispers were silenced by a deep, resonant voice that sent shivers down my spine. "You're ready," it said. The skeletal figure stepped out of the shadows, its grin wider than ever. "Welcome to the family." As it spoke, the chains descended again, wrapping around my arms and legs. But this time, they didn't hurt. They felt right. The whispers returned, their voices soothing and familiar. I was no longer a victim. I was part of the asylum now, a part of its darkness, its torment, its hunger, and as the next poor soul stumbled through the doors, their face pale with fear, I couldn't help but smile. Hollowbrook had claimed another. "This content may violate our usage policies. Did we get it wrong? Please tell us by giving this response a thumbs down." You said, "Write a prompt to generate the horrific thumbnail. ChatGPT said. ChatGPT, a dilapidated mental hospital hallway bathed in eerie, flickering light. Blood splatters stain the cracked walls, and shadowy figures with twisted faces loom in the background. At the center, a blood-soaked operating table holds a scalpel and chains, surrounded by dark, ghostly tendrils. The title, Hollowbrook Asylum, The Torture Within, is scrawled in a horrific, jagged font, dripping with blood. The atmosphere is suffocating, with a mix of decay, terror, and malevolence. The man stumbled into the room, his face frozen in terror as his eyes darted between me and the bloodied walls. I felt his fear in the air, a tangible, electric charge that sent a thrill through me. My mind screamed for sanity, for some shred of humanity, but my body acted on instinct, guided by the whispers and the deep, resonant voice. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the room. His panicked screams filled the space as he banged on the door, pleading for it to open. Please. Someone help me. The whispers in my mind twisted his cries into something melodic, almost hypnotic. I stepped forward, the cold steel glinting in the dim light. My footsteps were slow, deliberate, the sound of my boots echoing off the blood-stained tiles. No. Stay away. The man shouted, backing against the wall. I tilted my head, the scalpel catching the light as I dragged it against the wall, leaving a thin trail of blood behind. The room seemed to respond, the walls pulsating like a beating heart. The man slid to the floor, tears streaming down his face. Why are you doing this? He sobbed. I knelt in front of him, the whispers guiding my every movement. Because they chose you. With a swift motion, I grabbed his arm, dragging him to the operating table. He fought me, kicking and thrashing. But the chains above came alive, wrapping around his limbs and hoisting him into the air. His screams turned guttural, raw with desperation, as the chains twisted his body into a crucifixion-like pose. I placed the scalpel against his chest, pausing to feel the rapid beat of his heart beneath the blade. The whispers urged me on, their voices growing more insistent. With a deep breath, I pressed down, the scalpel slicing through flesh and muscle. His scream was deafening, reverberating through the room as blood poured from the wound. The sight of it, the rich, crimson flow against his pale skin, was intoxicating. I worked methodically, carving intricate patterns into his chest. Each cut guided by the sinister voices in my head. You'll thank me, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if the words were for him or for myself. The man's head lolled to the side, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wasn't dead, not yet, but his spirit was breaking. And that was when the real torment began. The chains tightened around his limbs, pulling with a slow, agonizing force. The sound of his joints popping and his bones snapping echoed through the room, a macabre symphony that made my heart race. Stop. Please, stop. He begged, his voice hoarse, but I couldn't stop. The skeletal figure appeared again, its hollow eyes fixed on me. You're learning, it said, its voice like nails scraping against a chalkboard. But there's still more to do. I nodded, the scalpel trembling in my hand. The whispers guided me to his face, where I carefully began to peel away the skin. His screams were weaker now, his body limp as I worked, the blood pooling beneath him. The skeletal figure stepped closer, its bony hand resting on my shoulder. Do you feel it? Yes, I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I felt. Satisfaction? Horror? Both? Good, it said, its grin widening. Then you're ready for the next one. As if on cue, the door creaked open, and another figure was shoved inside, a young woman. Her eyes wide with terror. She froze when she saw the mangled remains of the man on the table, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. No, she whispered, backing away. This can't be real. But it was real. And she was next. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a haunting chant that filled the room. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick with the stench of blood and decay. The woman's screams joined the chorus as the chains came alive again, dragging her to the table. She fought harder than the man, her nails clawing at the floor as she was pulled closer. "Help me!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation, but there was no help. Not for her. Not for me. I picked up a bone saw, the weight of it familiar in my hand. The whispers guided me once more, and I began my work, her screams piercing the suffocating darkness. Each cut, each scream, each drop of blood brought me closer to the truth of this place. Hollowbrook wasn't just a hospital. It was a living entity, feeding on pain and suffering. And I was its newest instrument of torment. By the time I finished, the woman was unrecognizable, a twisted mass of flesh and bone that barely resembled a human. The skeletal figure clapped the sound sharp and jarring. "Well done," it said. "You've earned your place here." The chains released me, and I fell to my knees, the weight of what I had done crushing me. But even as I wept, I felt a dark satisfaction, a twisted pride in my work. The whispers quieted, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that echoed through the room, "Welcome to Hollowbrook." And I knew then that there was no escape. I was a part of this place now, bound to its horrors for eternity. And as the next victim was dragged through the door, their screams filling the air, I couldn't help but smile. As the skeletal figure faded into the shadows, the room pulsed with a life of its own. The blood on the floor began to seep into the tiles, feeding the insatiable hunger of the hospital itself. I stood motionless, my breath hitching as the chains retracted into the walls, silent and patient, waiting for their next prey. The whispers had grown quieter now, but their presence lingered like a phantom touch. My hands, slick with blood, trembled as I gripped the edge of the operating table. My mind was fractured, caught between the faint echoes of humanity and the overwhelming compulsion to obey the asylum's will. A faint shuffle echoed through the corridor beyond the door, the sound sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. The next victim. My pulse quickened as the whispers stirred, coiling around my thoughts like venomous snakes. I turned toward the sound, compelled by something primal and dark. The door creaked open slowly, revealing an older man, his face pale and his eyes darting around in terror. He was shackled, the chains clinking softly as he stepped inside, trembling. Behind him, two shadowy figures in the shape of nurses stood like sentinels. Their faces were voids, black and consuming, their forms barely tangible. The man fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Scalpel's edge gleamed as it descended, its cold steel kissing my chest. Pain exploded through my body, raw and unforgiving, as the figure's jagged grin loomed over me. Its eyeless sockets burned with malevolent glee, its skeletal hands steady and methodical. Blood pooled beneath me, warm and sticky, seeping into the cracks of the ancient operating table. My screams echoed in the cavernous room, swallowed by the relentless whispers that now roared with excitement. "You thought you could escape," the figure hissed, carving slow, deliberate lines into my flesh. "You are Hollowbrook, and Hollowbrook is you. There is no escape from what you truly are." My mind reeled, drowning in agony and terror. Memories surfaced unbidden, fragments of truth clawing their way into the light. I wasn't just a victim of the asylum, I was its creator. I saw myself in another life, years ago, walking these same blood-stained halls. I was the doctor who designed the experiments, who turned the patients into playthings for my twisted curiosity. "No," I gasped, my voice trembling. "That's not possible." The figure chuckled, its laughter reverberating like a death knell. "Denial is futile, doctor. Your sins birthed us, and now we thrive within you." It plunged the scalpel deeper, slicing through muscle with sickening precision. My vision blurred, but I couldn't die, not yet. The asylum wouldn't let me. It kept me alive to endure every moment of torment, feeding on my suffering like a ravenous beast. Around me, the walls pulsed, alive and hungry. Faces emerged from the oozing surfaces, their mouths frozen in eternal screams. These were the patients I had condemned, their souls trapped within the asylum's malignant embrace. They stared at me, accusing and anguished, their spectral forms writhing as though yearning to break free. "Release us," one of them moaned, her voice a haunting echo. "End this nightmare." "How?" I choked, tears mixing with the blood on my face. The figure leaned closer, its breath rancid and cold. To end it, it whispered, you must pay the ultimate price. Only your complete surrender can free them, and yourself. It held up a jagged shard of glass, its edges glinting menacingly. Take it, it commanded, placing the shard in my trembling hand. End your suffering. Give us what we need. I stared at the shard, its surface reflecting my broken, bloodied face. The whispers grew deafening, urging me to act, to sever the tether between my life and the nightmare I had unleashed, but as I gripped the shard, another realization struck me. This wasn't about redemption. It was a trap. The asylum thrived on pain, on torment. My death would only feed its insatiable hunger. Condemning the souls trapped within to eternal suffering, no, I said, my voice stronger now. I won't play your game. The figure snarled, its skeletal form twisting and contorting. You dare defy us? It roared, the room trembling with its fury. Summoning every ounce of strength, I drove the shard into the figure's chest. It howled, its body dissolving into a torrent of black ichor. The walls screamed, the faces writhing in agony as the asylum began to collapse around me, the chains holding the patients shattered, their spectral forms rising like smoke. They turned to me, their expressions shifting from rage to gratitude. Thank you, they whispered, their voices a soothing balm against the chaos. As the last of them disappeared, the asylum crumbled into darkness. I stood alone in the void, my body whole but my mind fractured. The skeletal figure's voice echoed one final time, cold and venomous. This is not the end. You can't destroy what you are. We will always be with you. I woke in my apartment, the morning light streaming through the window. The scars on my chest were gone, replaced by smooth, unblemished skin. The photograph of Ryan, Lisa, and Kate sat on the table, their faces serene. For a moment, I believed it was over. But then the whispers returned, soft and insidious, curling around my thoughts like smoke. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The grin was back, wider and more menacing than ever. The asylum wasn't gone. It had merely shifted, taking root in the deepest recesses of my mind, and I realized, with chilling clarity, that the true horror wasn't escaping Hollowbrook.